How did a ragtag army, outnumbered 3-1, manage not just to halt, but literally to wipe out one of Europe's finest military machines, the English heavy cavalry? Conventional wisdom credits a clever choice of terrain, the bogs, and the Scots' incredible fighting spirit. But that's only part of the story, a convenient smokescreen concealing the true secret. The Battle of Bannockburn wasn't just a battle, it was a masterpiece of military engineering, where the battlefield itself was transformed into a colossal killing machine. And I invite you now, not merely to hear a story, but to become forensic investigators who, alongside me, will crack the code of this engagement and witness how the intellect of one man proved more devastating than thousands of knights' lances. To understand what transpired, we must first cast aside everything we think we know about warfare and transport ourselves back to June of 1314. Inhale this air. It's no fresh mountain breeze. It's the thick, acrid smoke of thousands of peat fires, mingling with the scent of damp, undyed wool, the sweat of thousands of men, and sour, watery ale. The air of the Scottish camp is the very breath of poverty and desperate resolve. Now, listen closely. These aren't stirring marches. This is the unsettling, monotonous drone of bagpipes, akin to the buzzing of a giant insect, and the guttural, clipped speech of dozens of Gaelic dialects. Here, there's no gleam of polished steel, only a dull glint on thousands of spearheads. This is an army assembled not by command, but by the call of blood. Now, let's transport ourselves a few miles away to the English encampment. The scene shifts dramatically. Here, the air carries the scent of roasted meat and fine French wine. It rings with the confident clang of first-rate armor, polished to a mirror sheen by attentive squires. Instead of guttural shouts, crisp commands echo in Norman French. In place of small, hardy garrons, enormous war destriers, each worth a small village, stand ready. The English army isn't merely a fighting force. It's a mobile city, a dazzling display of imperial might. Hundreds of tents, banners emblazoned with the crests of England's greatest houses, a supply train stretching for miles. They hadn't come to fight. They had come to punish and to savor every moment of it. To grasp the chasm separating these two forces, we must decipher two cultural codes. The first, the Scottish clan. For a Highlander of the 14th century, a clan was far more than just family. It was his entire universe, his social safety net, his sole law, and his religion. He fought not for an abstract Scotland, but for his chief, for the honor of his name, and for the land where 10 generations of his ancestors had lived. Betraying his chief was worse than death itself. Robert the Bruce wasn't simply a king to them. He was the paramount chieftain who managed to unite dozens of these warring microcosms in the face of a common foe. The second code, English chivalry. For an English aristocrat, war was the ultimate form of self-affirmation, almost a sacred ritual. The main objective wasn't tactical success, but personal valor and glory. Their god of war was the heavy cavalry charge, an unstoppable avalanche of steel and fury that crushed everything in its path. Infantry, especially poorly armed foot soldiers, were not warriors to them, but despised cannon fodder, mere backdrop for the display of knightly power. They simply could not conceive of Scottish infantry as a serious threat. It was beneath their aristocratic dignity. And so, on the field by Bannockburn, it wasn't merely two armies that clashed. Two utterly distinct philosophies of war collided. On one side stood a pragmatic, desperate fight for survival, where the ends justified any means. On the other, a ritualized, overconfident display of power, shackled by dogma and prejudice. The English had arrived for a knightly tournament of immense scale. The Scots were preparing for total war, a fight to the death. Robert the Bruce's project was the most audacious guerrilla startup in history. He dared to challenge a colossal military corporation, one boasting limitless resources. He possessed nothing but a team of fanatically loyal followers and an utterly asymmetric mindset. He didn't attempt to mimic his adversary or build his own Scottish cavalry. Instead, he understood that the only path to victory lay in transforming the enemy's greatest strengths, their knightly pride and tactical inflexibility, into their most profound vulnerabilities. He intended to make the system attack itself. The ultimatum was the initial spark, igniting an irreversible chain of events. Stirling Castle, the last critical English stronghold in Scotland, was under siege. Its commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, had struck a chivalrous agreement with Robert the Bruce's brother, Edward. If a massive English army failed to arrive and lift the siege by midsummer of 1314, the castle would surrender. For English King Edward II, it was a matter of honor. For Robert the Bruce, it was a deadly trap. He could no longer hide in the mountains and wage guerrilla warfare. He had been issued a challenge he couldn't refuse. Otherwise, he would lose everything: his authority, the support of the clans, and the very idea of an independent Scotland. The clock was ticking. Confronted with this threat, any sane commander of the era would have seen only one option: retreat. To gather an army and face the English king in open battle was pure suicide. Bruce commanded approximately 6,000 foot soldiers and only a few hundred light cavalry. Edward was leading an armada of up to 20,000 men, including 3,000 heavy knights in the finest armor money could buy, and thousands of renowned Welsh archers whose arrows could pierce plate armor clean through. This wasn't just a force, it was a punitive expedition. Every military logic of the 14th century screamed, "Run, melt into the mountains, bide your time." And this is where a brilliant idea was born. Robert the Bruce, trapped in a cage of circumstances, made a monumental mental leap. He decided not just to accept battle, but to fundamentally alter the rules of engagement. If he couldn't match the enemy in brute force, he would have to surpass them in intellect. If his army was a hammer too small to break the English anvil, then he would arrange for the anvil to break itself. His revolutionary concept was incredibly audacious for its time. He would fight not just with men, he would make the very earth fight. The battlefield ceased to be merely a location. It was destined to become a weapon, a meticulously engineered and camouflaged mechanism of destruction. The engine of this idea was the Scottish infantry, organized into what were called schiltrons. Imagine a gigantic hedgehog of steel and flesh, hundreds of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder in several circles, bristling with a forest of 12-foot spears. This formation was almost invulnerable to a frontal cavalry charge. No horse in its right mind would hurl itself against such a wall of pikes. However, the schiltron had a fatal weakness. It was static and vulnerable to archers. Before Bruce, the schiltron was a symbol of passive, desperate defense. But in his plan, it became not a shield, but a lure. An impregnable wall against which the most powerful wave was meant to break, but only after that wave had fallen into his primary trap. The reaction of his own battle-hardened comrades was initially close to shock. James the Black Douglas, Thomas Randolph, these were masters of lightning raids and ambushes. They were accustomed to striking and vanishing. Their king's proposition to march into an open field, stand firm, and wait for the full might of England to crash down upon them contradicted all their combat experience. When Bruce ordered his men to start digging up the land, transforming a flat field into a minefield of concealed pits, many must have considered him insane. He was asking them to trust not the sword, but the shovel. He was demanding faith in an engineering design that no one had ever tested on such a scale. And what of the English? Their reaction was predictably arrogant. Scouts undoubtedly reported that the Scots were gathering near Stirling and digging holes. To the English barons, whose lineages stretched back to William the Conqueror, this news could only have elicited a contemptuous sneer. Peasants digging the earth like moles. It seemed to them not a tactical ploy, but a sign of animalistic fear. They couldn't even imagine that behind these pitiful holes lay cold mathematical calculation. Their class arrogance and unwavering belief in the invincibility of a knightly charge completely blinded them. They saw what they wanted to see: a cowardly enemy preparing for a final, hopeless defense. This news landed like a bombshell, but its shockwaves rippled in opposing directions. In the Scottish camp, it ignited a volatile mix of terror and resolve, galvanizing the army around their king in an act of blind trust. In the English encampment, however, the revelation merely stoked their sense of superiority and an impatient eagerness to quickly crush the pathetic Highlanders. No one in the English world had anticipated such audacity from the Scottish king. More importantly, no one grasped that this audacity wasn't in the decision to fight, but in the brilliantly simple plan of how to do it. The central metaphor that unlocks the full truth about Bannockburn is this. The battlefield was not merely a location, but a meticulously engineered cascading trap. Robert the Bruce transformed several acres of Scottish soil into a deadly mechanism comprising 3 interconnected parts: a psychological lure, an engineered barrier, and a steel annihilator. This was not a defense. It was an attack disguised as a defense. Bruce wasn't waiting for the enemy. He had carved out a perfect corridor of death for them and simply waited for them to walk right into it. Let's peer under the hood of this war machine. It all began with a brilliant understanding of the adversary's psychology. Bruce knew that English knights, puffed up with pride in their valor, wouldn't be able to resist the temptation to personally lead the charge and sweep aside the peasants. He knew they would choose the straightest, flattest, and driest stretch of land for their irresistible onslaught. And it was precisely this very stretch that he transformed into his main weapon. He didn't try to guess where they would strike. He actively showed them where to strike, making that direction simultaneously the most enticing and the most lethal. The engineering heart of this mechanism lay in the very pits of Stirling. Modern research reveals these weren't just random holes. This was an enormous, carefully designed system of traps covering the entire front of the anticipated attack. Imagine a field pockmarked with thousands of small but deep pits, roughly knee-high to an adult. Each one was camouflaged with a thin layer of branches and turf, making them absolutely invisible to a horseman charging at full gallop. The goal wasn't for the horse to fall in completely, but for it to break a leg at full speed. The effect of just one such pit, the multi-hundred-pound carcass of a horse, along with its steel-clad rider, toppling over, instantly creating chaos in the dense ranks of the attackers. But Bruce's genius lay in their arrangement. The pits were dug in a strict checkerboard pattern. This prevented them from being bypassed. Wherever the cavalry veered, it inevitably encountered the traps. This system functioned like a giant filter or sieve. It instantly shattered the main advantage of a knightly charge, its monolithic, synchronized impact. Instead of a unified steel avalanche, a disorganized, stumbling mass of panicking men and animals now surged towards the Scots. Moreover, the placement of the pits naturally guided or channeled the flow of attackers into the one spot where there were no traps, a narrow, boggy depression near Bannockburn. And there, at the end of this deadly funnel, the steel annihilator awaited them, the Scottish Schiltrons. Their role now becomes crystal clear. They weren't merely a wall. They were the anvil onto which Bruce directed the crushing English hammer. The knights, their ranks already broken, their morale undermined by the fall of their comrades, were now compressed into a dense, uncontrollable mass within the boggy trap. They lost speed, maneuverability, and the space to strike. And at that precise moment, the hitherto stationary hedgehogs of spears began to move. The Schiltrons slowly, inexorably, started to constrict the cauldron, transforming the knightly elite into helpless targets. Let's visualize this process step by step, precisely as it was conceived. Step 1. The English cavalry, brimming with contempt for their foe, begins what they believe is a flawless charge across the level field. Step 2. The front ranks, at a full gallop, smash headlong into a camouflaged minefield. Dozens of horses shatter their legs, their riders sent sprawling as the rear ranks pile into those ahead, transforming their formation into a tangled, bloody mess. Step 3. Those who survive instinctively try to bypass the chaotic zone, funneling into the only seemingly safe passage that Bruce, with calculated generosity, has left open for them. Step 4. This passage leads them straight into a swampy lowland, where their horses bog down and the density of the panicked throng reaches critical mass. Step 5. The Scottish schiltrons, which until this moment had stood unyielding as bedrock, begin a slow, methodical advance, simply impaling the trapped and disoriented knights on their formidable 13-foot spears. This was no mere battle. This was a cold-blooded, methodical extermination engineered by a genius of military strategy. Bruce didn't just utilize the terrain, he redesigned it, transforming it into an integral part of his army. He compelled physics, geometry, and psychology to fight on his side. The English lost the battle before they even struck a single blow, because they failed to grasp that the true enemy that day wasn't a Scottish soldier wielding a spear, but the very ground beneath their feet. We marvel at the brilliant plan, but who truly brought it to life? A humble Scottish Highlander who spent weeks before the battle digging those very pits. He was no engineer. His sole tool was a primitive shovel fashioned from wood with an iron tip, or perhaps merely a sharpened stone. Day after day, beneath the biting Scottish rain, he painstakingly excavated tons of thick, wet earth. In preparation for the battle, he single-handedly moved a weight comparable to that of 10 of those very knightly war horses for whom he was meticulously preparing this mass grave. And he did this not for coin. He did it for his clan, for his king, and for the profound belief that this land was, irrevocably, his own. Bruce's genius could never have been fully realized without his 2 loyal lieutenants, 2 vastly different architects of this victory. The first was James the Black Douglas, the supreme master of guerrilla warfare. He was Bruce's shadow. While the main army prepared the battlefield, Douglas's elusive detachments clung to the flanks of the English army, denying them sleep, incinerating their fodder, and slaying their sentries. He inflicted no crushing blows, yet he instilled in the English a constant, soul-draining sense of unease and insecurity. He was the very element of chaos that prevented the massive English war machine from operating cohesively. The second was Thomas Randolph, the king's nephew. If Douglas was the shadow, Randolph was the rock. It was to him that Bruce entrusted command of one of the pivotal schiltrons, strategically positioned in the center. He was the very embodiment of unyielding discipline. Legend has it that on the first day of the battle, Randolph, through a moment of carelessness, allowed a detachment of English cavalry to slip past his positions towards Stirling. Bruce, witnessing this, hurled at him the famed rebuke. "A rose has fallen from your chaplet." Stung to his core, Randolph and his schiltron immediately gave chase, encircled the knights, who vastly outnumbered and outmatched his detachment, and in a brutal struggle annihilated every single one of them. This was the kind of man who would rather die than fail to execute an order and maintain formation. Without the fanatical loyalty of men like Douglas and Randolph, even the most brilliant plan would have remained nothing more than a blueprint drawn in the sand. And now, for a striking, everyday detail that truly grounds this entire history. An English knight's warhorse, a destrier, commanded a king's ransom, roughly equivalent to the cost of a modern-day tank or a high-performance luxury sports car. Its price alone equaled the annual income of an entire small village. Now, consider this comparison. The most prized possession of a Scottish infantryman was his 13-foot spear. Its value was hundreds, if not thousands, of times less. This means that a single warhorse in the English army cost more than the entire arsenal of an entire company of Scottish soldiers. On the field of Bannockburn, it wasn't merely 2 armies that clashed. It was 2 economies, 2 worlds, colliding. And poverty, amplified by intellect, proved mightier than arrogant yet predictable wealth. The meticulously crafted machine was assembled and primed. Thousands of masked pits awaited their grim harvest. Tens of thousands of spears were honed to a razor's edge. The Scottish army, holding its breath, froze in anticipation, poised for the enemy to take its first fatal step into the perfectly laid trap. And at this precise moment, when everything hinged on cold discipline and precise calculation, the human element detonated the situation from within. A brilliant plan teetered on the brink of utter collapse, all because of one single person. And that person was Robert the Bruce himself. The perfect storm ignited on the first day of the battle, June 23rd. The English vanguard began a cautious advance. And then, from their ranks, a young English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, suddenly broke away. He saw what he simply couldn't unsee, a solitary figure on a small pony inspecting the Scottish lines. On this figure's helmet rested a simple golden crown. It was the King of Scots himself. For a knight raised on ballads and tournament glory, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. To slay an enemy monarch in single combat before the eyes of two armies and etch his name into history forever. Forgetting orders, tactics, and common sense, de Bohun lowered his lance and thundered into a charge. In that instant, all of Bruce's complex engineering strategy crumbled. He ceased to be a commander-in-chief and reverted to being a warrior. To flee was unthinkable. It would mean eternal dishonor and would shatter the morale of his entire army. To accept the fight was almost certain death. Rushing toward him, on his small, nimble horse, with only a battle-axe in hand, was a steel-encased battering ram atop a colossal war-horse, a destrier. The entire plan, the fate of Scotland, the lives of thousands of his men, all of it condensed to a single point, to the trajectory of the knight's charging lance. And this is where the paradox of his genius shone through. The very personal courage, the warrior spirit that had made him a national leader, now became the chief threat to his own strategic design. He, the architect of victory, was forced to violate the cardinal rule of his own plan. Do not engage in knightly duels, but act as a cohesive mechanism. Yet, he accepted the challenge. He calmly waited until de Bohun closed to striking distance. At the last possible moment, Bruce sharply yanked the reins aside. His pony swerved, and the enormous lance whistled mere inches past him. And as a stunned de Bohun hurtled past, Bruce rose in his stirrups and brought his axe down with all his might onto the knight's helmet. The blow was so catastrophic that the axe not only pierced the steel but also split the knight's skull, and the haft splintered into 1,000 pieces. The Scots roared with exhilaration. The English vanguard, demoralized by the death of their champion, retreated in disarray. The victory on the first day was complete. But when Bruce returned to his ranks, he was met not only with adulation, but also with angry reproaches from his comrades. He, the mastermind of the operation, its single indispensable component, had risked everything for one single blow. He had won the duel, but had very nearly lost the war. Round 1 went to the Scots, but it was won not because of the plan, but in spite of it. It was a victory of instinct over calculation. Yet the main English army had not yet entered the fray. Now they were not merely overconfident. Now they were enraged and thirsting for vengeance. The unexpected victory in the duel created a new, even more terrifying threat. Would it compel the English to act smarter the next day, to bypass the traps and unleash their full might where the Scots were most vulnerable? It would be intellectually disingenuous to claim that victory was solely forged by Bruce's genius and his engineered death trap. There exists another, less heroic theory, which posits that the Scots won not so much because they were brilliant, but because the English were catastrophically incompetent. Their king, Edward II, was a weak and indecisive ruler, despised by his own nobility. His army was not a monolith, but a tangled knot of intrigues and rivalries. At the decisive moment of the battle, the two principal English commanders, the Earls of Gloucester and Hereford, practically squabbled over who would lead the first attack. Consequently, their offensive was not a coordinated strike, but a series of fragmented suicidal charges that merely simplified the work of the Scottish meat grinder. There's also a third version, one that injects an element of popular myth into this tale. Chronicles recount that at a critical juncture on the second day, with the battle's outcome still hanging by a thread, the English ranks suddenly faltered and fled. The cause of this panic wasn't another Shiltron attack, but the appearance of a new army on a nearby hill. These were thousands of people from the Scottish baggage train, servants, cooks, women, who, seeing their warriors gaining the upper hand, snatched up sheets and blankets, lashed them to poles like banners, and charged downhill with wild cries. To the exhausted and demoralized English, this appeared to be the arrival of fresh Scottish reserves. It was the final blow to their will to fight. Perhaps the great battle was won not only by soldiers, but also by ordinary people whose spontaneous bravery transformed victory into triumph. But beneath all this tactics and heroism lies a cold, economic reality. Bannockburn isn't just a battle, it's the largest business deal in Scottish history. By seizing the English camp, the Scots acquired treasures that, by today's standards, could be compared to a national annual budget. Tens of thousands of pounds sterling in gold and silver, expensive fittings, tents, weapons, and most crucially, hundreds of knightly armors and war horses. With that money, they could have built a fleet or several impregnable castles. The victory at Bannockburn became a colossal investment that financed Scotland's War of Independence for many years to come. Furthermore, the primary asset in medieval warfare wasn't just spoils of war, but prisoners. Every captured knight or baron wasn't merely an enemy, it was a lottery ticket with an enormous payout. Ransom sums were astronomical. For instance, Robert the Bruce didn't take money for the captured Earl of Hereford, one of England's wealthiest men. He exchanged him for his wife, daughter, sister, and several comrades who had languished in English prisons for 8 years. This wasn't merely a transaction, it was an act of ultimate justice, where the price of one enemy aristocrat proved equal to the price of a royal family. And finally, the hidden meaning. The choice of the battleground, directly beneath the walls of Stirling, was more than just a tactical decision. It was a political manifesto. Stirling Castle had been considered the key to Scotland for centuries. Whoever possessed it symbolically held the entire country. By giving battle precisely here, Bruce wasn't just defying the English army, but the entire imperial idea of England. He was saying, "We are no longer hiding. We are here on the threshold of our chief symbol, and we will reclaim it by force." The battle itself became a symbol. The act of digging pits wasn't just a military stratagem. It was a metaphor for how the toil of a common person, their shovel, triumphs over aristocratic might, over the warhorse. Bruce didn't merely win a battle. In the language of war, he penned a new declaration of independence, where the intellect and will of a nation proved more vital than money and social superiority. And now, having seen it all, the engineer king coldly sketching the plan for a deadly mechanism on the ground. The contemptuous English knight, blinded by his own arrogance, the simple Scottish warrior clawing at sticky clay for weeks, and the economic undercurrent where the future of a nation hung in the balance, the picture becomes clear and terrifyingly logical. All these disparate threads, tactics, psychology, economics, and personal drama, intertwine into a single, taut knot. Bannockburn was neither a miracle nor an accident. It was the result of a perfectly executed system. This system worked because each of its elements amplified the others. English arrogance was not merely their weakness, it was fuel for the Scottish machine. It was their belief in the invincibility of their cavalry that compelled them to choose that very sole corridor that Bruce had prepared specifically for them. The fanatical loyalty of the Scottish clans was not just morale, it was the sheer manpower that allowed a field to be transformed into an engineering masterpiece in mere weeks. Even Bruce's risky duel, which nearly unraveled everything, ultimately worked to his advantage. It not only inspired his own forces, but also provoked the English to act even more fiercely and recklessly the next day, driving themselves deeper into the trap. What, then, is the secret to the Bannockburn phenomenon? Robert Bruce was no mere general who simply outmaneuvered his foes by using the landscape to his advantage. His genius lay elsewhere. He grasped that one could wage war not against an army, but against its very ideology. He didn't try to defeat English chivalry head-on, he compelled it to commit suicide. Robert Bruce hacked into the enemy's operating system and coded a virus for it. The English army's operating system in the 14th century was deceptively simple, yet devastatingly effective. An unstoppable cavalry charge that crushed everything in its path. All other elements, archers, infantry, merely supported this primary thrust. The virus Bruce created, a system of disguised pits, was ingeniously simple. It didn't directly annihilate the knights. It attacked the very principles of their power, speed and monolithic formation. The pits transformed the English's primary weapon, their kinetic energy, into their greatest adversary. The faster and more furiously they charged, the more horrific the consequences. Their strength became the force of their own undoing. What's more, Bruce waged war on their very mentality. He knew that an English aristocrat disdained peasant labor. The notion that digging mere holes could constitute a serious military tactic was both humiliating and laughable to them. He built his defense not from stone and steel, but from their own class prejudices. He leveraged their arrogance as camouflage for his trap. They lost not because they were weak warriors. They lost because their minds, shackled by the dogmas of the chivalric code, proved less flexible than Scottish steel. This was asymmetrical thinking in its purest form, a triumph of the unconventional. Bruce refused to play by their rules. He didn't try to assemble an army that was a mirror image of the English one. He forged an army that was the perfect antidote. He pitted intellect against wealth, cunning against brute force, and engineering ingenuity against predictable tactics. The field by Bannockburn became the proving ground where, for the first time in medieval history, it was definitively shown that well-organized and highly motivated infantry, wielding terrain as a weapon, could not just withstand, but utterly destroy the elite of heavy cavalry. His genius was that of an architect, not merely a general. He designed the battle like a building, where every element was precisely placed and performed its function. The enemy's psychology served as the foundation. The engineered traps were the load-bearing walls, and the unyielding Scottish schiltrons, the steel roof that crashed down upon the enemy at the most opportune moment. And when you look at it from such a vantage point, you grasp the sheer scale of the vision. This transcends mere politics or warfare. It is a design of titanic, almost mathematical proportion. It is the art of enthusiastically marching your enemy into the very grave they dug for themselves, simply by letting them follow their nature. The victory at Bannockburn was a stone cast into the calm lake of European history, its ripples spreading even now. The first and most powerful ripple was a direct political domino effect. 6 years after the battle, in the year 1320, the Scottish nobility, intoxicated by their newfound confidence, dispatched a document to the Pope known as the Declaration of Arbroath. This wasn't merely a plea for recognition of independence, it was a philosophical bomb detonated in the very heart of the medieval world. Within it, for the first time in European history, the idea was clearly articulated, that a king rules not by divine right, but by the consent of the people. And if he betrays his people, the people have the right to depose him. This genetic code of liberty, penned on parchment in 14th century Scotland, did not die. It smouldered for centuries, only to ignite in the works of Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, David Hume. And from them, this idea traversed the Atlantic, forming the bedrock of another, even more famous document. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the American Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the people's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, He stood on the shoulders of Scottish giants, who, in turn, stood on the shoulders of the warriors who triumphed at Bannockburn. The chain is direct. Without the victory on that marshy field, there would have been no confidence to birth the Declaration of Arbroath. And without it, the global history of freedom would look utterly different. But the legacy of the battle doesn't just live in dusty archives, it echoes in stadiums. When the Scottish rugby or football team takes the field today, tens of thousands of voices swell in unison, singing "Flower of Scotland." It's their unofficial anthem, and its lyrics are a direct, verbatim description of the Battle of Bannockburn, of how the Flower of Scotland met Edward's army and sent him packing to think again. Every time Scots sing this song, they mentally return to that field, drawing strength from it for the modern sporting battle at hand. It is the primary soundtrack of the Scottish soul, penned in spears and blood 700 years ago. We draw upon the legacy of Bannockburn, even when we simply tell stories of David and Goliath. This battle became an archetype, the quintessential national myth of how a small but proud nation can defeat a mighty empire not with brute force, but with wit and will. This underdog story is so deeply embedded in their culture that it has become part of the national character itself. And of course, the blue flag with the white saltire, St. Andrew's Cross. It was precisely after the Wars of Independence, culminating in the triumph of Bannockburn, that it definitively cemented its status as a symbol not just of a patron saint, but of a free nation capable of defending itself. And here lies the central paradox of this legacy. All this desperate, bloody, almost 300-year struggle for independence from England, crowned by Bruce's triumph, ultimately concluded with Scotland voluntarily signing the Act of Union in 1707, becoming part of Great Britain, uniting with its eternal enemy. The ideal for which thousands of lives were sacrificed seemed to have been betrayed by a stroke of a pen, but this is only at first glance. In reality, it was the ultimate manifestation of the strength born at Bannockburn. Bruce's victory and the subsequent decades of struggle forged such a robust and self-sufficient Scottish identity that by the early 18th century, it no longer feared being absorbed or annihilated. Scotland entered the Union not as a conquered province, but as an equal partner, preserving its unique legal system, its church, and its educational framework. The paradox is that the very victory in a war for separation made a future peaceful unification possible. Bannockburn gave the Scots the confidence not that they could fight forever, but that they no longer needed to do so to remain themselves. Let's pause for a moment and transport ourselves from the 14th century to our own, the 21st. What do we see around us? Gigantic corporations whose budgets exceed those of many countries, competing with audacious startups that have nothing but an idea and a 5-person team in a garage. We see cumbersome government machines attempting to counter agile and elusive networks of activists. We witness established media empires losing the information war to a lone blogger with a million-strong audience. It might seem like the chaos of our time, but in truth, we are simply witnessing a new, modern Bannockburn. Edward II's army is the perfect prototype of that very behemoth legacy corporation. It has everything: unlimited resources, the best technology of its era, a storied name, and an unwavering belief that its business model, built on knightly cavalry, will work forever. Robert Bruce and his army are the quintessential startup. They have no money, no resources, no cutting-edge technology, but they possess a profound understanding of their competitors' weaknesses, a fanatical devotion to their idea, and a readiness to employ absolutely asymmetrical methods that seem wild and undignified to the big player. And here crystallizes the crucial, non-obvious lesson of this story, a lesson more relevant than ever. The lesson of Bannockburn isn't just the cliché that brains beat brawn, it's a lesson in how exactly they do it. To defeat a vastly more powerful system, you don't attack its strengths. You must locate its core, load-bearing element, the very thing upon which all its might and pride rests, and transform it into a mechanism of self-destruction. Bruce didn't try to fight the knights. He fought the very idea of knighthood. He knew that their code of honor, their hubris, their tactical doctrine would not allow them to act any differently than they always had. Their strength was in their predictability, and Bruce exploited this predictability like a lever. He created an environment where following their own rules and instincts led them directly into a trap. He won the battle not on the field, but in the minds of the English commanders long before the first blow was struck. This principle is universal. It explains how Netflix defeated Blockbuster, turning its physical store-based business model against itself. It explains how guerrilla armies overcome conventional forces, transforming their heavy equipment and complex logistics from an advantage into a burden. Victory doesn't go to the strongest, but to the one who most deeply understands their opponent's operating system and discovers a logical vulnerability within it. And here is the preliminary conclusion this story leaves us with. The greatest prison any system can find itself in, be it an army, a corporation, or an entire civilization, is the prison of its own success. The rules that once propelled it to the top eventually calcify into unshakable dogmas that strip it of flexibility and blind it to new threats. And the lesson of Bannockburn is that the most effective way to defeat such a giant is not to break down the walls of its prison, but simply to nudge it into crashing headlong into them itself. To truly grasp the scale of the catastrophe, we must do the unthinkable. Stop seeing the English as cartoonish villains, arrogant and foolish. That's a falsehood. Edward II's English army was no rabble of aristocrats, but the inheritor of one of the most effective military systems of its era. It was a perfectly tuned machine for chivalric warfare, a machine that had proven its superiority for decades in Wales, in France, and yes, in Scotland itself. Their logic was the logic of victors, founded on concrete experience. Heavy cavalry, gaining momentum on open ground, was a divine hammer that decided the outcome of any battle. They weren't foolish. They were professionals at their craft. They just came to a war, but stumbled into something entirely different. Let's view the Scots through their eyes. To an English baron, whose culture was built on rules, hierarchy, and the chivalric code, Bruce's army was something wild and incomprehensible. It wasn't an army in their understanding. It was a horde. Their leader, Robert Bruce, was no noble monarch, but a perjurer who had murdered his rival right in a church. Their tactics, ambushes, night raids, burning their own lands before the advancing enemy, seemed not military cunning, but barbarism and cowardice. They didn't offer an honest fight. They stung from the shadows like wild animals. The cultural shock was colossal. The English arrived at a jousting ground, expecting to prove their superiority in fair, open combat. They prepared for a grand tournament. The Scots, however, transformed the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The Duel of Henry de Bohun offers the perfect illustration. From the perspective of chivalric logic, his act was the pinnacle of valor. To challenge the enemy king to single combat, to decide everything with one strike. It was beautiful. It was noble. Bruce's response, to dodge and cleave his skull with an axe, appeared in their eyes as a cowardly assassination. They brought a code of honor to the battlefield, but encountered the pragmatism of survival. And within this system of values, the news that the Scots were digging pits elicited not fear from the English, but contempt. It confirmed their conviction. Only cowards and savages would fight that way. War for gentlemen is waged with swords and spears, not shovels. They couldn't even imagine that this wasn't a desperate attempt to entrench, but part of a cold engineering calculation. Their minds refused to process this information because it didn't fit their worldview. They saw not cunning, but weakness. The undoing of the English lay in their sheer predictability. Their entire military might, their very civilization, was meticulously constructed upon order and the strict adherence to time-honored strategies. Their greatest strength, the perfectly synchronized cavalry charge, tragically became their Achilles' heel. This tactic demanded specific, almost surgically precise conditions. A perfectly flat field, ample room for a thunderous charge, and an enemy already teetering on the brink of collapse. So absolute was their faith in this method's efficacy that a contingency, a plan B, simply didn't exist in their strategic lexicon. Throughout their history, they had successfully driven nails with a gargantuan hammer, utterly incapable of conceiving that an adversary might not present a nail to be struck, but rather a hidden landmine. Their hallowed traditions, their rigid order, their centuries of ingrained warfare experience had forged a gilded cage around them. They were utterly unprepared for a new paradigm of thought, one where the very earth transformed into a weapon, and a humble peasant's shovel became a more formidable instrument than a knight's gleaming sword. They perished not because they were inferior warriors, but because they confronted a future of warfare that their chivalric minds were utterly incapable of comprehending or embracing. The strategic genius of Robert the Bruce wasn't forged in the quiet halls of a library or on the disciplined parade ground. Instead, it was hammered out in the crucible of the most horrifying moral compromise imaginable. 8 years before Bannockburn, in the year 1306, Bruce arranged a meeting with his chief rival for the Scottish crown, John Red Comyn, ostensibly for negotiations. Their rendezvous was not on a windswept battlefield, but within the hallowed sanctuary of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Beneath those sacred arches, on ground where any act of violence was deemed both a mortal sin and a profound sacrilege, an argument erupted. Bruce drew his dagger and plunged it into Comyn. Bursting from the church, he cried out to his waiting men, "I believe I've slain Comyn." One of his stalwart companions, Roger de Kirkpatrick, retorted, "You think so? I'll make sure of it," and strode back into the church to dispatch the dying man. This act was far more than mere murder. It was a devastating political, religious, and personal suicide. With that single brutal dagger thrust, Bruce not only eliminated a rival, but forever stained his immortal soul, incurred excommunication from the church, and most catastrophically, ignited a full-blown civil war across Scotland. Now, arrayed against him was not only the formidable might of England, but also the powerful Comyn clan and their vengeful allies, all clamoring for blood. This was the fateful decision from which there would be no retreat. He would either ascend to the throne as king or perish as a despised outcast. It was this heinous act that irrevocably transformed the aristocratic nobleman into a desperate, cornered animal. The psychological portrait of Bruce in the years that followed is that of a man plumbed to the absolute depths of despair. He had lost everything. His army lay shattered, his 3 younger brothers had been captured and savagely executed by the English, and his wife and infant daughter were languishing in prison. He himself became a wraith, a king without a kingdom, perpetually on the run, hiding in the crags and islands, sleeping beneath the open sky on beds of heather, hunted by men and tormented by his own inner demons. The crushing weight of his responsibility was almost insufferable. He, who had boldly proclaimed himself Scotland's protector, had thus far brought her nothing but fresh war and ruin. Loneliness at the top. His top was a cold, wind-swept, rain-soaked rock, and his sole companions were a mere handful of equally desperate fugitives. It was in these bleakest of years that the pampered aristocrat within him died, giving birth instead to a ruthless and astonishingly resourceful guerrilla leader. He learned to trust only himself, to think several steps ahead of his adversaries, and to grasp that in the brutal fight for survival, no tactic was off-limits. The idealist who had once yearned for a crown had transformed into a hardened pragmatist for whom victory was the sole, unyielding moral imperative. And upon the altar of this longed-for victory, he would sacrifice his dearest kin. The harrowing tale of his brother, Nigel Bruce, serves as the starkest embodiment of the horrific price that had to be paid. Young, handsome, and universally beloved, Nigel was captured by the English while bravely defending Kildrummy Castle, a refuge for the women of the Bruce family. He was not simply executed, he was subjected to the most agonizing death known to the Middle Ages, the brutal ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering. While still alive, he was taken down from the gallows, his entrails were gruesomely ripped out and burned before his very eyes, and only then was he finally beheaded and his body hacked into 4 pieces. This was no mere execution. It was a brutal, visceral message directed squarely at Robert himself. "This is the steep price of your rebellion," it screamed. Every time Bruce rode into battle, he saw before his mind's eye not only the potential future of Scotland, but also the grotesquely mutilated body of his beloved brother. His strategic brilliance was fueled not solely by the flickering embers of hope, but by an unquenchable thirst for vengeance and the gnawing burden of guilt. The individual who masterminded the ingenious engineering trap at Bannockburn was no longer a knight. He was a surgeon, dispassionately dissecting an enemy army. Years of humiliation and profound loss had taught him to view warfare not as a chivalrous contest of honor, but as a ruthless mathematical equation. And he solved it, employing the same merciless logic that had once compelled him to draw a dagger in a church. He understood that monumental objectives demanded monumental sacrifices, and he was prepared to pay any price, even if that price was his own soul and the spilled blood of his family. To truly grasp the aftermath of the battle, one must set aside the romanticized myth of 2 utterly alien civilizations clashing. In truth, it was less a meeting and more a brutal divorce. Prior to the Wars of Independence, the Scottish and English aristocracies were interwoven threads of a single cultural tapestry. A Scottish baron conversed in the same Norman French as his English counterpart, devoured the same chivalric romances, and swore fealty for lands straddling the nominal border. It was a singular, elite club. The war, culminating in Bannockburn, delivered an unyielding ultimatum to every member of this exclusive fraternity. Who are you, Scottish or English? The choice wasn't between 2 distinct cultures, but a gut-wrenching decision made within one's own, savagely tearing apart centuries-old bonds of blood, marriage, and feudal allegiance. It was in this searing crucible that the most astonishing hybrid emerged, a unified Scottish nation. Before Bruce, Scotland was a patchwork quilt of disparate peoples. In the north, the Gaelic-speaking Highland clans disdained the lowland dwellers. In the south, the Lowlanders, speakers of Scots, a Germanic dialect closely akin to English, in turn considered the Highlanders uncivilized savages. And towering above them all was a French-speaking aristocracy. These 3 worlds rarely intersected. The army at Bannockburn became the very first pan-Scottish endeavor in history. In a single battle line, shoulder to shoulder, stood everyone. The Highlander from near Inverness, for whom warfare was simply an extension of a cattle raid. The farmer from outside Edinburgh, fiercely protecting his harvest. The townsperson from Perth, fighting for trade privileges. And commanding them all was a knight, for whom French was more native than Gaelic. This wasn't a synthesis. It was an alloy, forged under the relentless hammer blows of the English upon a Scottish anvil. They marched onto the battlefield as representatives of clans and towns, but they departed from it as Scots. The second hybrid to emerge was language. Prior to the war, the Scots tongue was largely dismissed as merely a northern dialect of English. After Bannockburn, it began its triumphant march. To speak, it became a potent political statement, an act of cultural defiance. The language absorbed words from Gaelic, French, and Scandinavian tongues, transforming into something truly unique and indigenous. Within a few decades, Scots would be used to write laws, chronicles, and magnificent poetry. It would become the language of the royal court, displacing French. Bannockburn transformed a dialect into a full-fledged national language, becoming one of the principal markers of a new, distinct identity. But how did this seismic shift alter the lives of ordinary people? For the farmer living along the Anglo-Scottish border, victory at Bannockburn ushered in a centuries-long nightmare. Before the wars, the border was, in many ways, a mere formality. People traded, intermarried, and grazed their livestock on shared pastures. After the battle, a bloody chasm opened between the two nations. The border transformed into a perpetual war zone, giving rise to a unique breed of people, the border reivers, professional raiders and cattle rustlers from both sides. Old habits vanished. Peaceful commerce was supplanted by predatory raids. Instead of traditional farmhouses, people began constructing pele towers, narrow, towering stone fortresses, the only reliable refuge from a sudden incursion. A new, ingrained habit took root in their very bones, sleeping with weapons close at hand, and at the sound of a warning bell, immediately saddling their horses. The abstract political victory achieved in the heart of the country translated, for those living on the frontier, into 3 centuries of terror, hatred and survival according to the brutal laws of the wolf pack. The grand battle for independence forged a nation, but it also dug a trench between 2 neighboring peoples that would not be filled for nearly 400 years. Robert the Bruce triumphed at the Battle of Bannockburn, not just on the field, but within the hearts and minds of the people. His ascent to the throne began with a catastrophic public relations debacle. The church murder branded him not a hero, but an excommunicated blasphemer. To survive, he needed to rewrite his own story. And he did, crafting one of the most enduring myths in Scottish history. His propaganda machine, primarily composed of oral storytellers and later chroniclers, meticulously constructed his image. From a desperate fugitive hiding on remote islands, he was transformed into a wise, exiled king undergoing a divine trial. The legend of him, in his darkest despair, observing a spider repeatedly fail to spin its web 7 times before finally succeeding on the 8th attempt. This is no mere charming fable. It's a brilliant stroke of propaganda, transmuting a string of humiliating defeats into a parable of unwavering resilience and divine destiny. The English, in turn, waged a powerful counter-propaganda campaign. To them, he was not Robert I, King of Scots. He was King Hob, a derisive nickname subtly implying his common origins and the illegitimacy of his rule. English chronicles depicted him as a perfidious traitor who had violated his feudal oath of allegiance to the English monarch. His principal crime, the murder of Comyn, was presented not as a political necessity, but as damning proof of his diabolical, treacherous nature. The Scottish army, in their accounts, was not a force of patriots, but a rabble of savage Highlanders, utterly devoid of honor or the rules of warfare. And this black propaganda proved incredibly tenacious. The image of Bruce as a ruthless and cunning opportunist became firmly entrenched in English historiography for many centuries, only beginning to be re-evaluated in the 20th century. History is, indeed, written by the victors, and the Battle of Bannockburn itself stands as a prime example. The official Scottish version, immortalized in John Barber's epic poem, The Bruce, reads like a chivalric romance. In it, King Robert delivers a fiery speech about freedom before the battle, worthy of a Hollywood film. His single combat with Henry de Bohun is depicted as an act of incredible personal valor that inspired his entire army. The victory is presented as a miracle, a triumph of spirit and justice over brute force. But what do we see if we examine the sources from another perspective and consider the archaeological data? English chronicles, such as the Vita Edwardi Secundi, describe not a heroic epic, but chaos and rampant incompetence. They attribute the defeat not to Bruce's genius, but to the treacherous marshy terrain, and more significantly, to a bitter quarrel between the English Earls of Gloucester and Hereford, who, fueled by pride and jealousy, broke formation and led their respective detachments to slaughter separately. In their version, it was not a great Scottish victory, but a shameful English defeat due to internal squabbling, and archaeology provides the definitive final word. LiDAR scanning of the battlefield, which revealed a complex, mathematically precise system of traps, completely alters the narrative. It proves that the main protagonist of the battle was not so much Bruce the warrior, but Bruce the engineer. The Scottish version, brimming with heroism and pathos, barely mentions the pits, downplaying their significance. The English version speaks of ill fate and unfortunate terrain, and only the impartial laser beam shows us the truth. This was not a battle, but a cold-blooded execution, where the key role was played not by bravery, but by the shovel and precise calculation. The victorious Scottish propaganda proved so potent that the myth it created, a battle of heroes, overshadowed the real story of a battle of engineers for centuries. Bruce won the information war twice, first by convincing the Scots to die for him, and then by convincing future generations that this victory was a miracle rather than a brilliant and brutal plan. The victory at Bannockburn should have been a period, a definitive end to a long, bloody saga of freedom. But it became a comma. Instead of healing wounds and building a new Scotland, Robert the Bruce made a fatal decision that irreversibly warped the very essence of his struggle. He concluded that the best defense was a robust offense. And so, in the year 1315, just 1 year after his triumph, he dispatched his brother Edward with an army of Bannockburn veterans to conquer Ireland. The idea of liberating his own nation mutated into a project to create a pan-Gaelic empire. The end ceased to justify the means. War became an end in itself. This decision created a deep rift within Scottish society, even if it wasn't an overt rebellion. The conflict simmered between two former allies, two distinct types of warriors who had triumphed over the English. The first type was Edward Bruce himself, intoxicated by victory and boundless ambition. For him, and those like him, war had become both a profession and the very meaning of existence. He saw Ireland not as an ally, but as a stepping stone to his own crown, a path to glory rivaling his brothers. He embodied a new, pragmatic reality where power conferred the right to expansion. The second type was the nameless Scottish veteran, a soldier who had followed Bruce not for empires, but to see the English garrison cleared from his town to ensure foreign horses no longer trampled his fields. His war had ended at Bannockburn, and now, exhausted and weary, he was being sent to die for foreign lands, for the ambitions of a royal brother. For him, the invasion of Ireland was not a continuation of the struggle, but a betrayal of it. The nation's resources, its people, its very will, all that should have been dedicated to rebuilding Scotland, were now being consumed in the furnace of a new, alien war. The very tactics employed by the Scots in Ireland became the symbolic act marking this turning point. It was a chilling reflection. An army that only yesterday had fought as liberators against the scorched earth tactics of the English now employed those same brutal methods itself. Scottish soldiers torched Irish crops, condemning to starvation the very Gaelic populace they supposedly came to liberate. Yesterday's victim now donned the mask of the executioner. Imagine a Scottish warrior who, 10 years prior, had watched the English burn his home village to ashes. And now he stands in the middle of an Irish field, one indistinguishable from his own, bringing a torch to a stranger's harvest. In that very moment, the grand idea of liberation devours itself, transforming into its complete antithesis. The Irish adventure ended in catastrophe. After 3 years of bloody warfare, which exacerbated the Great Famine, Edward Bruce's army was crushed and he himself was killed. The campaign brought Scotland nothing but thousands of dead and moral bankruptcy. The grand dream of a league of free peoples devolved into a senseless massacre. A second point of no return had been crossed. The hero liberators discovered they had more in common with their former oppressors than they cared to admit. So, who truly benefited in this new, free Scotland? At the top were those who had staked everything on Bruce when he was still an exile. His loyal lieutenants, the Black Douglas, Thomas Randolph, and other comrades in arms, transformed from rebellious barons into pillars of the new regime. This was more than just a changing of the guard. It was a complete reset of the elite class. The lands of the Comyn clan and all who had supported the English were confiscated and distributed among the victors. The most massive redistribution of property in the nation's history took place. A new aristocracy arose, not by right of birth, but by right of the sword. These were battle-hardened, fiercely loyal wolves who remembered the taste of blood and humiliation and had no intention of relinquishing what they had conquered. But what became of the untold riches seized from the English baggage train? The nation's economy did not flourish. It lay in ruins. Decades of war had transformed the fertile southern plains into a scorched wasteland. Towns were devastated, and trade with its primary partner, England, had ceased entirely. The massive ransom acquired for prisoners was almost entirely squandered in the pointless Irish adventure. The economy had to be rebuilt from scratch, and Bruce accomplished this with both genius and ruthlessness. Land, not money, became the principal resource. He forged a new feudal system where land was granted not for noble birth, but for military service. In essence, all of Scotland was transformed into one vast military encampment, poised to repel any new invasion at a moment's notice. Trade routes dramatically shifted direction. Instead of heading south toward England, Scottish merchants turned their gaze eastward and northward toward France, Flanders, and the cities of the Hanseatic League. This forced economic reorientation towards the continent shaped Scotland's foreign policy for the next 300 years, laying the foundation for the famed Old Alliance with France. But what about the common folk? For them, the upheaval was far from over. It became the fabric of everyday life. Victory didn't bring peace. It merely institutionalized war. This was especially true for those living in the borderlands. They evolved into a unique people of warrior farmers, one hand holding the plow, the other a spear. Life became an endless cycle of skirmishes, raids, and retaliatory punitive expeditions. The psychology of the survivors was a volatile cocktail of euphoria and paranoia. On one hand, there was an intoxicating sense of national pride. The myth of Bannockburn, of the invincible King Robert, became a new civil religion. It gave ordinary people a feeling of belonging to something grand. For the first time, a Highlander and a lowland farmer felt themselves not merely members of a clan, but part of a unified nation, Scots. Yet, on the other hand, it was a collective trauma. 30 years of continuous warfare bred a deeply ingrained siege mentality. The primary marker of Scottish identity became not who you were, but who you were not. You were not English. This negative self-identification, born from a hatred of their powerful southern neighbor, became both the nation's primary binding force and its chief curse. People's worldview narrowed to a simple binary opposition, us versus them. And this psychology, forged in the fires of Bannockburn, would define the character of the Scottish people for centuries. Proud, unyielding, eternally ready for a fight, yet forever scarred by their brutal birth. Beneath the clang of steel and the cries of the dying lay more than just a dispute over land. Bannockburn was a battleground for two fundamentally different ideas about the nature of power. The core philosophical concept driving this entire bloody process was encapsulated in a simple question: who owns the country? The English model offered an unequivocal answer. The country belongs to the king by right of conquest and divine will. It was his personal property, his fiefdom. The Scottish side, largely out of necessity, forged a revolutionary doctrine for its time. The country belongs to the community of the kingdom, the communitas regni. The king was not an owner, but the first servant, the guardian of this land, ruling with the consent of the people, represented by the barons and clergy. This was a clash between absolutism and the nascent concept of popular sovereignty. The intellectual engine, the grey eminence behind this new idea, was a man who may never have met Bruce, but whose philosophy gave him the moral right to rebellion. This was the greatest Scottish thinker of the Middle Ages, the Franciscan friar John Duns Scotus. His intricate theological system contained one revolutionary thought: the primacy of will over intellect. More simply put, Scotus argued that free, conscious choice was more important and fundamental than any predetermined order or logical scheme. In a political sense, this meant that the act of will by the Scottish people, choosing Bruce as their king, could be more legitimate than a formal, externally imposed feudal oath to the English monarch. Duns Scotus's philosophy became the intellectual oxygen that prevented the flame of the Scottish rebellion from suffocating under the weight of accusations of perjury. Opposing this doctrine was the powerful, centuries-honed Anglo-Norman concept of feudal law. For King Edward and his barons, the world was a strictly ordered pyramid. At the apex, God, below him his anointed king, and beneath him his vassals, bound by an unbreakable oath of fealty. In this system, Bruce's actions were not merely rebellion, they were a sin, a violation of sacred order, an act of cosmic defiance. The oath sworn to a liege lord was absolute. To break it meant not only committing treason, but also endangering the salvation of one's immortal soul. This clash of ideas was directly reflected on the battlefield. The English army, built on rigid hierarchy and the predictable tactics of a knightly charge, was the physical embodiment of their worldview, orderly, inflexible, confident in its divine rightness. The Scottish army, on the other hand, flexible, employing unorthodox methods, relying on cunning and engineering ingenuity, was the embodiment of voluntarist philosophy. If reality doesn't align with your goals, change reality. If you lack heavy cavalry, make the very land fight against it. Bannockburn became a brutal physical debate between these two philosophies. The idea of a commonwealth of the realm, in the form of bristling schiltrons of spears, stood firm against the idea of a kingdom as personal property embodied by armored cavalry. Bruce's victory proved that the will of a nation, united in the face of threat, could be stronger than even the most powerful feudal war machine. The culmination of this philosophical triumph was the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. This document, dispatched to the Pope, was more than just an appeal for independence. It was a manifesto for a new political philosophy, born in the throes of war. It contained lines that were 400 years ahead of their time. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be subjected to the domination of the English. For it is not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up except with life itself. In these words, the philosophy of Duns Scotus and the blood of Bannockburn converged, giving birth to an idea that would change the world. The magnificent system created by Robert Bruce was like a perfect fighting machine, assembled by the genius of a single designer. But in 1329, the designer died, and the machine, without his guiding hand, immediately began to fall apart under its own weight. There was no mighty external enemy to crush it. The system began to devour itself. Its primary strength lay in its battle-hardened, independent and fierce aristocrats, whose energy Bruce had skillfully directed against a common foe. After his death, this energy, lacking direction, turned inward, like a centrifugal force tearing Scotland apart. The crown was inherited by a 5-year-old boy, David II. The real power, however, fell to the very wolves who had helped Bruce conquer the kingdom. These were not statesmen. They were warlords whose lives were war. Their loyalty belonged not to an abstract crown or nation. Their loyalty was personal to Robert Bruce, their comrade in arms and chief. When he died, their oath died with him. A repugnant but predictable struggle for the inheritance began. The inheritance was not the crown, but the regency during the young king's minority, meaning complete control over the country. The great heroes of Bannockburn, or their sons, transformed from allies into mortal enemies. The Black Douglases, the Randolphs, the Stuarts, Each of them tore at the grand idea of a united Scotland, wrapping their personal ambitions in its tattered flag. Each interpreted Bruce's legacy to their own advantage. He would have wanted me to rule, or my clan made greater sacrifices, so it's our right to decide. The unity born in the trenches beneath Stirling drowned in courtly intrigues and feudal squabbles. This internal paralysis created a perfect window of opportunity for England. The son of Edward II, who had been humiliated at Bannockburn, the young and energetic Edward III, craved revenge. The English found their claimant to the Scottish throne, Edward Balliol, son of Bruce's old enemy, and supported his invasion. The Second War of Scottish Independence began, but this time it was less a war with England and more a brutal civil war, with Scot killing Scot. The great victory at Bannockburn turned into its opposite. It brought no peace, only postponed a new, even more terrible slaughter. Yet even in this chaos, a last shard of the old heroic era remained. This was Sir Andrew Murray, a legendary figure. His father had fought and died alongside William Wallace. He himself was a comrade of Bruce, his loyal general. When the country descended into chaos, it was Murray, already aging and wounded, who became the guardian of Scotland. He was the last bearer of the true idea, the idea of a Scotland united not for clans or barons, but for its own sake. Murray was a brilliant commander. He routed the English and their Scottish allies, employing the same guerrilla tactics as Bruce. For a time, it seemed as though the spirit of Bannockburn had been resurrected, but he waged a war on two fronts, against an external enemy and an internal one, against the greed and treachery of the Scottish nobility. He was the last Atlas, holding up a collapsing sky. He didn't fall in some epic last stand, surrounded by enemies. His end was far more mundane, and perhaps all the more tragic for it. In the year 1338, after yet another grueling campaign, he simply succumbed to exhaustion and old wounds. With his passing, the last vibrant thread connecting nascent Scotland to the heroic age of Bruce and Wallace snapped. The age of Titans drew to a close. A long, agonizing stretch of the Middle Ages commenced. The grand system didn't fall from a mortal blow to the heart. Instead, it withered from a slow internal decay as those who remembered its founding purpose faded away. The blood and steel of Bannockburn slowly dissolved into the mists of history. Over the ensuing centuries, amidst an age of endless internecine strife and venomous court intrigues, the battle's magnificent legacy became all but completely warped. Robert Bruce, the cool-headed strategist and ruthless politician, transformed into a figure of popular folklore, a Scottish King Arthur, if you will. His brilliant tactical master plan was forgotten, relegated to a simple narrative of bravery and sheer luck. And the most revolutionary document of that epoch, the Declaration of Arbroath, became little more than a dusty parchment in an archive, its explosive philosophical power holding no interest for a world where absolute monarchs once more asserted their divine right to rule. Scotland remembered that it had won, but nearly forgot how and for what purpose it had achieved that victory. Then, at the cusp of the 18th and 19th centuries, in a thoroughly transformed era, a moment of profound rediscovery dawned. Scotland had been part of Great Britain for well over 100 years. Gone were its own army, its own parliament, its own independent foreign policy. And yet, precisely when it seemed national identity should have dissipated, it instead flamed into being with a new, unbelievable force. And the man who struck the match to this powder keg of memory was none other than the writer Sir Walter Scott. He was, in a sense, the Steven Spielberg of his age. He gathered half-forgotten chronicles, somber ballads, and dense historical tomes, transforming them into enthralling, globally celebrated novels and poems. He breathed new life into Bruce, Wallace, and other heroes, weaving them into a new, romantic national myth. Thanks to Scott, the saga of Bannockburn transitioned from being the exclusive domain of scholars to the cherished property of the entire nation, becoming the unifying grand narrative for Scots, from the humble shepherd in the Highlands to the esteemed professor in Edinburgh. The effect was a cultural explosion. Scots, though full-fledged citizens of the British Empire, reignited their love affair with their own singular history. But here's the central paradox. New eras always interpret old texts through their own lens, imbuing them with the meaning they require in their present moment. The 19th century Romantics, in their reading of Bannockburn, saw something entirely different from the reality. They conjured images of noble knights, Gothic castles, picturesque landscapes, and lofty sentiments. They craved a narrative of valor and honor, and this new romanticized version had no room for the battle's core secret. The notion that victory was secured by thousands of mud-filled pits, painstakingly dug by common peasants, felt far too prosaic, too unchivalrous. The engineering genius was sacrificed at the altar of the warrior genius. The true, pragmatic and brutal history was supplanted by a convenient, captivating legend. Furthermore, the political message itself underwent a complete reinterpretation. For Scott and his contemporaries, the Bannockburn saga wasn't a rallying cry for a fresh rebellion. Instead, it served as powerful evidence that the Scots, a great and ancient nation, had entered into union with England not as a subjugated province, but as a proud and equal partner. The narrative of a hard-won struggle for independence morphed into a cultural bedrock for life within the empire. Thus, Scotland's greatest document of divorce became a poignant argument for a happy marriage. And here, at the very culmination of our inquiry, history comes full circle. Cast your mind back to where we began, with the question of how a smaller nation could assert its right to exist against the might of a colossal empire. Now consider the headlines of today's newspapers: an independence referendum, the far-reaching repercussions of Brexit, and the ongoing debates about Scotland's very future. 700 years later, on a fresh turn of the historical helix, the fundamental question persists. Only the armor and weaponry have changed. Tweed jackets have replaced steel plate, and voting ballots stand in for spears. But the struggle for the soul of the nation, ignited by Robert Bruce, marches on. And within this ongoing cycle, the central, intractable paradox of this entire saga reveals itself. The greatest act of separatism, the bloodiest and most glorious victory in the war for independence, the Battle of Bannockburn, did not usher in an era of eternal isolation. Quite the contrary. It was this very battle, by forging an unyielding, self-assured Scottish identity, that made the future unification with England psychologically possible. To become an equal partner in a union, one first had to prove that they could decisively defeat their future ally in battle. The very drive for absolute separation, paradoxically, created the conditions for the most enduring union in history. And so, we are left to grapple with this enigma. A victory that should have forever driven two peoples apart ultimately bound them even closer, though on entirely new terms. Bannockburn provided no definitive answer. It merely posed the fundamental question that each new generation of Scots must ask themselves again and again. Contemplating all of this, a final question arises, one for which no answer exists, nor ever could. Was Bannockburn the grand finale, etching Scottish identity in stone once and for all? Or was it merely the opening act of a drama whose conclusion is being written even now, in polling booths, in pubs, and around kitchen tables? And is the victory achieved 700 years ago an eternal sentence to struggle, or did it, at last, grant the right to simply make a free choice?